So let's pray. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in real knowledge and discernment, so that you may approve the things that are excellent, in order to be sincere and blameless until the day of Christ, having been filled with the fruit of righteousness, which comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. Dear Father, we are exceedingly excited that the Lord Jesus Christ is with us this morning by his Spirit in the room, and that therefore there is one very wise person. And we pray that you would lead us towards your wisdom. Please help me to speak in a way that makes that wisdom available and accessible and clear and points people to it. And please help us all to receive the words that you have for us this morning. Amen. Amen. So Andrew told me to say a word about myself, so I will do that very briefly. I'm English, as you can tell, grew up in Yorkshire, and I've been living in Melbourne since 2011, married to a wonderful Sydney-sider, Alison, and we have 2 kids, Benjamin, who's 7, and Emma, who's 4. So as you can imagine, we're sort of overflowing with free time. I was studying a very leisurely existence. We sleep through every night. And I also work at Monash University in the French department. So I do French philosophy, and I'm based in the French department. So you find me teaching French literature and film and grammar, all that sort of stuff for my day job. I do have a handout for this session that if you scan the QR code there, you'll get a Word document, which if you find that helpful to follow along, you may want to use that handout. I've been invited, and I've got the privilege of giving 2 sessions today. This morning session is going to be relatively theoretical. I think there's still a cutting edge, there's still a practical side to it, but I'm going to try and lay out some theoretical building blocks that are going to really sort of provide a context for doing cultural critique today. And then in the afternoon session, we're going to sort of roll up our sleeves and get our hands really dirty in contemporary culture. So if you find this morning a little bit theoretical, hang in there. I think it's necessary in order to get to the stuff that we're looking at this evening. Now, I wonder if I asked you, what are the main challenges facing Christ's church today? What you would answer? And when we get to the discussion time after this, I'd be really interested to know what you would answer. I guess there's the preserving the message, passing on the gospel, which of course is a huge challenge. There's evangelizing the nations, making disciples of all nations. Surely that must be the forefront of our priorities, given that that's what Jesus commanded us to do. I wonder how many of us would instinctively say that the great challenge facing the church today is finding a way to relate the Bible's teaching to our contemporary culture, what Andrew was calling contextualization. Does that strike you as a dominant challenge? Let me just read you something that Tim Keller, again, wrote a couple of years ago in a foreword to this book by Jake Meador, In Search of the Common Good. And these are his reflections. He says, I've been an ordained minister for nearly 45 years. When I entered the ministry, most of the divisions in the church seemed to be doctrinal. There were controversies about the charismatic gifts and Pentecostalism, about the end times and the second coming of Christ, about predestination and free will, about the meaning of baptism and the Lord's Supper. I entered a Presbyterian denomination in which there was a high degree of consensus on all those issues. Yet, today, my church, like so many others, is sharply divided, despite the fact that its ministers can agree on a very long and detailed doctrinal statement, the Westminster Standards. So why all the conflict? It's not as much over doctrine as over what our relationship to the culture should be. And as I look around, I see the same division royal in Christian denominations and organizations everywhere. And I guess if we think about that it really does impact everything, doesn't it? The way we understand the gospel message to relate to the culture has the capacity, if we do it wrongly, to distort the gospel message. And the way that we understand the gospel message to relate to the culture, if we do it wrong, has the capacity to hamstring our evangelism as well, trying to bring a message to people who have no categories of understanding of it. I, as I said, work in higher education, and I've seen this question shipwreck the faith of at least one people and make other people really wobbly in their faith, as they're sort of undergoing the storm of whatever it is, postmodern philosophy, say, in their studies, and then they've got the Bible over here. They just can't work out how to bring these things into conversation with each other. And for some people, that is faith threatening. That is an acute experience of walking away from the faith. So this is a really key question. And this is the question that I want to try and come at this morning. Let me sketch out a cultural situation for you. Society is divided into factions that increasingly shout at each other rather than talking with each other and are increasingly polarized. A thin veneer of freedom covers over quite an authoritarian and prescriptive mindset. We like to talk about being free, but we are in fact quite closely policed in what we're allowed to say and do, or at least in what we're accepted to say and do in society. The combination of the state and the market are remaking society in the image of competition and winners and losers. Those with the most profit win. The one remaining superpower seems to be tottering. It's unclear who's going to emerge as the next global superpower. And a society that thinks itself on the right side of history and that's put superstition behind it is riddled with self-contradictory, bizarre beliefs that if you'd only stop to think about it, it would find to be in tension with themselves. Well, this is a sketch of 5th century Rome. It is the context into which Augustine wrote what is almost certainly the primary work of Christian political philosophy in the last 2,000 years, namely the City of God. And what I'd love to do, and what I'm thrilled to be able to do, is to try and draw from this huge forbidding work 6 principles that are going to try and help us to understand how we might learn lessons from Augustine about how we might do cultural engagements. And I just want to sketch a little bit more of the situation in which he was writing this book, because I think, again, it is uncannily close to the situation in which we find ourselves today. So, on the one side, you've got thinkers such as, for example, Tertullian, who have a very particular understanding of the way in which the gospel relates to culture. And to caricature only slightly, for Tertullian, there's the gospel and culture like oil and water. We have to stick purely with what the Bible says, and we have to reject everything that's extra-biblical. And he thinks that we can do that. It's a sort of politics of condemnation of the culture. Anything that isn't in black and white in the Bible, we reject, we distance ourselves from. There's that famous quote, isn't there? What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Let me just read on a little bit from that quote, because we often get just that little bit, nothing else. He says, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Our instruction comes from the porch of Solomon, who had himself taught that the Lord should be sought in simplicity of heart. And he goes on, away with all attempts to produce a mottled Christianity of stoic, platonic and dialectic composition. We want no curious disputation after possessing Christ Jesus, no inquisition after enjoying the gospel. With our faith, we desire no further belief. Okay? So, oil and water. Bible, culture, yes, no. That's Tertullian. But you've also got thinkers like Eusebius, the great church historian. And Eusebius couldn't really be more different. His is the politics of collaboration, and particularly collaboration with Constantine, first Christian Roman emperor. So when Constantine becomes emperor, gets converted to Christianity, he thinks that all his Christmases have come at once. We've got our guy in charge now. Everything's going to be okay. So you've got these two sort of very antithetical ideas about culture. You've got the reject everything that's not the Bible and just get your guy in charge, and then everything's going to be okay. And it's in that sort of context that Augustine writes The City of God. And it's when we appreciate that, I think, that we can see how brilliant the City of God is in what it does. So we find ourselves, I think, without too much trouble in contemporary culture wars. So What does Augustine do? Well, first of all, before we open the front cover of The City of God, let's just think about Augustine. And I think that really crucially, he comes to these cultural ideas as what we can think of as an inside-outside. He's not completely inside the culture, but he's not completely outside it as well. He's inside it in the sense that he has grown up in late Roman culture. He knows it from the inside. He's not just read a crib sheet on what the Romans think and how to take it down in 3 easy steps. He's taught rhetoric in Carthage and Rome. He understands authors because he's read and appreciated them. In The City of God, he talks very tenderly about Cicero. He says he's a great orator, he's a wonderful philosopher. So he appreciates what is good about the culture into which he's ministering. And he follows, this is not his words, but I think it's a principle that sums him up well. He follows the principle of audi alteram partem. It just means listen to the other side. It's a sort of a little maxim that's often used by philosophers these days. And I think audi alteram partem, listen to the other side, has 2 elements to it. And I think the first one we do quite well, and the second one perhaps we don't do quite as strong. The first one is that we need to understand, obviously, the culture into which we're ministering. Not just have read a primer on it, but really understand. For him, it was Cicero who was the big god they were teaching. And so to be able to walk in the shoes of the culture and appreciate how people who have a particular view of the world understand the world, appreciate what is painful for them, why it's and so forth. But I think there's another element to this audi alteram partem that we sometimes miss because we sometimes reduce it to an intellectual exercise. I must understand the worldview of the people around me, and we think that's it. But people don't live ideas, do they? People live something because it excites them. I have a particular view of the world because I think it's good and true and beautiful and lovely. And so I think we've also got to understand why a particular view of the world sparkles, to use a way of putting it, for people. Like, why do people who class themselves as woke, why is that really, really exciting? Why do they love it? Why do they want everybody else to be woke as well? And I think until we can do both of those, both understand the ideas, but also why it's really attractive to the people who are in that particular view of the world, we haven't really understood or in a sense gained the right to be able to engage. So he's an insider, but, and this is crucial to have both, he's also very much an outsider. Now, his biography situates him outside. So he's not Roman, he's North African, from Targast in modern-day Algeria. So he's on the edge of the Roman Empire. His mother is a devout Christian, his father is a pagan. So there are all these biographical details that put him on the outside. But I think the main thing that puts him on the outside, that really comes out strongly in The City of God, is his commitment to the gospel. He can never find himself taking Roman culture completely seriously. It's always just a little bit bizarre and strange to him. He never sort of inhabits it comfortably. It always doesn't quite fit. It's sort of too short in the arms and sort of too long in the legs or something. And so there's these lovely examples in The City of God where at one point he's saying, usually it's okay to just have one person guarding a door. That's fine. Not for the Romans. They need 3 gods. They need a god for the hinges, a god for the door, and a god for the threshold. Because, one god has too much. It's too much for them to guard a door. And he just looks at Roman culture from the outside, just points out how weird it is. Like, you guys believe this? Like, 3 gods for a door? Seriously, how weak are these gods? And so he's always looking at it from a critical distance. And I think that is a very powerful position, isn't it? To be able to inhabit a culture from the inside, to understand what makes it sparkle for people, but also to be able to see it from a critical distance. The Bible was there before us, wasn't it? John 17, Jesus, high priest and prayer, in the world, but not of the world. And it's opening verses of 1 Peter, resident aliens, exiles, living in Jeremiah's letter to the exile. So there's nothing revolutionary and sort of building on the Bible. This is all there in the Bible, but Augustine is applying it to his age in a way that I think shows us how we might apply it to ours. So he's an inside-outsider. And I think it's worth just looking at the City of God as a whole. What is he doing? Well, first of all, he is critiquing the whole of late Roman culture. This is a big book. This is a sort of prop your desk up, keep your door open type book. And one of the reasons it's so big is that Augustine wants to range over the whole of late Roman culture, not just cherry pick certain ideas or concepts and sort of critique those, but have a look at the whole system, how it all fits together. And so in books 1 to 5, he's got a critique of pagan religion from various different perspectives. And then from books 6 to 10, he's got a critique of pagan philosophy. And again, he goes into various different perspectives on that. Now, a penny really dropped for me. A cent really dropped for me. Contextualization. When I heard an Augustine scholar called Charles Matthews talk about this, and he said that Augustine's City of God was the first time in the history of sort of Western ideas that anyone had taken a whole culture and tried to critique. So people have critiqued particular things before, but Augustine is the first one to try and do a comprehensive cultural critique. And that is really exciting for us, because it means that the origin of what I'm going to call critical theory, in a moment I'm going to try and define that, its origin is Christian. And the origin of all the critical theories that are around today is Christian. Augustine was the first to do this. And I think we're the best to do this. And so when we sort of launch into cultural critique, we're not trying to sort of jump on a bandwagon, a secular bandwagon. We're actually going back to the source of comprehensive cultural critique, which I think is Augustine's City of God. So he critiques the whole of the culture. He also uses the whole of the Bible to critique it. So the first half of the City of God is all about the culture. In the second half, he tells the story of the whole Bible. In fact, he begins before Genesis 1 with the angels, and he tells the story in terms of two cities, the city of God and what he calls the earthly city. It's not the city of man, because the fallen angels begin it. The city of God and the earthly city. And he traces these two through the whole Bible. And, he's quite systematic in sort of hitting all the major turning points of biblical history. And I think, again, this is such a powerful pattern for cultural critique. Because what often happens when Christians try to critique culture is we pick some of our purple passages, don't we? And we try to feed the whole of culture through those passages. And what we inevitably do, therefore, is we give a partial critique. We might go heavy on the doctrine of creation, for example. If we're a particular sort of disposition of Christianity, if we're a different sort of disposition, we might go heavily on the doctrine of sin. And by distorting the biblical story, by foregrounding some moments in the biblical story rather than others, we inevitably distort our critique of culture. Well, Augustine doesn't. He tells the story right from the beginning, right to the end. And I think this is the default position for cultural critique. I think this should be our reflex. And a quotation from Don Carlson's Christ and Culture Revisited puts it better than I think I could, so I'll just read it out. That stance, he says, is most likely to be deeply Christian, which attempts to integrate the major biblically determined turning points in the history of redemption: creation, fall, the call of Abraham, the Exodus, the giving of the law, the rise of the monarchy, the rise of the prophets, the exile, the incarnation, the ministry of death and resurrection of Jesus, the onset of the kingdom of God, the coming of the Spirit, and the consequent ongoing eschatological tension between the already and the not yet, the return of Christ, and the prospect of a new heaven and a new earth. Now, what happens when we do this, I think, is that we let the Bible set its own table. So this is the table picture down here. And what I mean by that is that we let the Bible get its own concepts out on the table in the way that it wants to get them out before we engage in cultural critique. And to slim it down to its shortest form, this is your creation, fall, redemption framework, CFR. And in doing that, it stops us from privileging our own particular bugbears or our own particular purple passages. It lets the Bible set its own table. Now, if you'll know, what we've done already is we've let the culture set its own table. So we haven't just cherry-picked bits of the culture. Augustine has tried to encapsulate the whole of late Roman culture. And so you're both, according to the culture, the right to set things out as it wants. You tell me what you want to tell me, culture, rather than me picking different bits. And you're doing the same to the Bible, letting the Bible set its own table as well. And I think this is just, it intuitively works, doesn't it? So imagine if I tried to tell you the story of Star Wars by saying, Well, there's this bit where they blow up the Death Star, and Luke, oh, by the way, he's the hero. Like, he's the one who blows it up because he's got this thing called Force. And then later on, there are these little guys called Ewoks. And then just a little bit before that, there's this really impressive scene where he says, I am your father. Oh, the guy who says, I am your father, like, he's a really bad guy with the helmet. And you think, what on earth are you talking about? Just start with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away and tell me the story. Well, perhaps if that's the way to approach Star Wars, that might also be the way to approach the Bible, rather than just parachuting particular passages or doctrines down for people who have no context at all, like the Ewoks. Who are they? Start from the beginning, as Augustine does. Tell the story, finish it. Falsely, Augustine has a fundamental critique of culture, not a superficial critique. So the culture will have ways of talking about itself, and late Roman culture had a way of talking about itself. It talked about itself in terms of justice. So Cicero has this idea that what holds a community together is its shared sense of justice. And Augustine goes, I'm not so sure about that. I think there's something deeper than justice going on. And for Augustine, that deeper thing is love. He says that people are really motivated by love. And by understanding what people love, we can understand how society works. His whole two cities idea is structured around two loves, really. You could call it rather than, Tale of Two Cities, you call it Tale of Two Loves. And this is the passage where he really explains that. He says, two cities then have been created by two loves. That is the earthly by the love of self, extending it to contempt of God. And the heavenly by the love of God, extending it to contempt of self. The one, therefore, glories in itself, the other in the Lord. The one seeks glory from men, the other finds its highest glory in God. Happiness of our conscience. The one lifts up its head in its own glory. The other says to its God, thou art my glory, the lifter up of my head. So for Augustine, when you trace things back far enough, you get past justice, you get past equality, you get past freedom, what you get to the bedrock of human society, what really motivates people is what they love. He's got this wonderful quote, just as the body is carried along by its weight, he says, people are carried along by their loves. And again, I think that's a very powerful pattern for us. So society will say lots of things about itself. This is what we believe. This is what's motivating us. This is where we're going. But Augustine says, I think I can show something below that helps explain these different things that you're telling me. And I think his idea that love is the deepest thing, and of course it's tied in with ideas of worship as well, is powerful and helpful as a tool of cultural critique for us. Here we are, the body is carried by its weight wherever it's carried, just as the soul, he says, is carried by its love. Next, he avoids, quite brilliantly avoids, in the City of God, having to choose between unmitigated antithesis between Christ and culture and an unmitigated idea that Christ fulfills culture. So he avoids choosing between Tertullian and Eusebius, if you like. And again, he's not inventing this. I think he gets it from 1 Corinthians 1. He doesn't say that, but it seems to me that he's following a pattern that Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians 1. And so you remember in that passage, Paul is faced with the major values of the two dominant cultures in which he's living. You've got the Greeks and the Jews. And he says Greeks love and Jews demand miraculous signs, which later in the passage he identifies with power. So you've got power and wisdom, these two great values, the things that society seek. And looking at what Paul does with those two values, I think is mind-blowing, just cutting-edge cultural critique. So, first of all, he identifies something that the two cultures want. Greeks, you really want wisdom. I can see that. You're searching for it. You love it. You talk about it all the time. Jews, you really want power, a demonstration of God's power, miraculous power. And then Paul says, you can't have them in the way that you're searching for them. Think of Acts 17. You keep meeting to discuss the latest ideas, and you never really find one that you like. You're always waiting for the next one. It doesn't seem that you've satisfied with the wisdom that you've got, Greeks. And also, the Jews looking for miraculous signs. You've been looking for a long time, and you're still looking. And so, what he does then is he really sort of ups the ante, and provocatively, he introduces a weak and foolish Christ. He introduces a Christ to the cross. And he said, these Greeks, you want wisdom. Well, how about the foolishness? The moria, from which we get the word moron. How about the foolishness of a man strung up on a cross as a criminal? How about that for wisdom? And of course, they will think, well, there's nothing more foolish there. That's the absolute antithesis of what we think of as wisdom. And then he sort of taps the Jews on the shoulder and he says, you're looking for power. How about a man dying in agony, nailed to a cross for power? Do you think that's powerful? And they will go, Paul, whatever you've been drinking, you need to stop. Because there is nothing less powerful. And so they see these things as a stumbling block and folly. They look at Christ and say, that's not wise, that's not powerful. Paul says, wait a minute. What if the fullness of what you're searching for, the fullness of wisdom and the fullness of power, is actually to be found in the place that you are least likely to look through, in the place where you would least likely think it to be? Just what if? What if that was actually God's wisdom? And what if that was actually God's power? Well, then how foolish and weak you would be to miss it. And he says, if you're willing to go through the cross, if you're willing to humble yourself and to transform your idea of what you think wisdom is and transform your idea of what you think power is, you will actually find a wisdom and a power greater than you ever dreamed possible. And he uses the same word, Sophia. You're searching for Sophia, for wisdom. Let me show you the Sophia of God that is wiser than your wisdom. So he compares the two and he's saying, this is better wisdom than your wisdom. And this is better power than your power. So what's he done? He's kept both absolute antithesis and absolute fulfillment. So he says the cross is foolishness and weak. That's your antithesis. He's not saying, yes, the cross is like your wisdom, but to be better. And the cross is like your power, but to be better. So keep going in the direction you're going. No, absolutely not. The cross is foolishness and the cross is weak. And Tertullian's going, go, Paul, that's my man. Yes, weak, foolish, oil and water. We love you, Paul. And then he says God's wisdom is wiser than human wisdom. And God's power, God's weakness, sorry. God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. And God's weakness is more powerful than human strength. And he's showing how God fulfills these cultural values. And Eusebius is going, I told you so. Fulfillment, there you go. And so you see both what Eusebius and Tertullian got partially right. Paul is showing us how actually those two things fit together. And what our cultural critique has done is it's dismembered bits of this Pauline paradigm and it's opposed them to each other and it's got them fighting each other. So now it's Eusebius versus Tertullian, whereas Paul shows us, no. So those are both heresies. Those are both partial articulations of what a full-orbed Christian cultural critique is. And this is what Augustine does. I think he follows this pattern. And he does it in terms of what a contemporary writer called Dan Strange, I think really helpfully, is called subversive fulfillment. So if you want to put a label on what Paul is doing here and what Augustine is doing, I think we could do worse than subversive fulfillment. So subversion in the sense that the cross is foolish. It's the antithesis of what you're expecting. It's weak. Okay? You're not going to follow your cultural values through on a straight line and get to Jesus. That ain't going to happen. Antithesis. But fulfillment in that God's weakness is stronger than human strength and God's foolishness is wiser than human weakness. So if you're really serious about wisdom, you Greeks, if you really want wisdom, you're going to have to come to the cross because that's where you find its fullness. And you Jews, if you really want strength, you're going to have to humble yourselves. You're going to have to admit that Jesus is the Messiah because God's weakness is stronger than your strength. That's subversive fulfillment. And this is how Dan Strange puts it. He says, the gospel subverts in that it confronts and picks and overthrows the world's stories. It calls for new ways of looking at the world because the old ways are so useless and harmful. It's an appeal for repentance and faith in the better story of Christ crucified. Half the story. That's your Tertullian. However, he says, the gospel fulfills in that it connects and is shown to be worthy of our hopes and desires. The gospel is appealing in that it's a call to exchange old hopes and desires for new ones, because these new ones are the originals from which our false stories are smuggled and written to face. So, Greeks, your idea of wisdom is a bad photocopy of God's wisdom. Why not go for the original? And Jews, your idea of power is some sort of third-hand Chinese whisper of the real idea of power. And so why not have a look at the original and see the fullness of what you're searching? Now, Augustine's very, very cheeky. He begins the city of God with a word that is almost certain to get people very annoyed indeed. I want to quote it in Latin because the lovely thing about Latin is you can change the word order. So you put the most important word at the front, whereas in English you can't do that. So he starts at first word, book 1, chapter 1, line 1, city of God. Gloriosissimam civitate Dei. Punk. And what Augustine is doing is he's saying, so in English the translation is, most glorious is the city of God. The city of God is the most glorious. And we think, okay, fine, but that doesn't seem terribly controversial to me. But we've got to understand what glory meant for the Romans. So glory, gloria, was one of the supreme Roman values. It was what Rome prided itself on. And the glory of Rome is Rome's empire, its army, its domination. You want to see our glory? We will crush you. That is our glory. We will get taxes from you. We will bring your national treasures and we'll put them in Rome and you will serve us. That is our glory. Okay? That is not a Christian idea. That is not a biblical idea. That is, my army is bigger than yours and I've got more weapons than you, so I'm going to dominate you and I'm going to master you and you're going to serve me. That's glory. So, Augustine starts the city of God. Oh yeah, that's us. We're glorious. Actually more glorious than you are. Now what is he doing? Like, it would be the equivalent, I don't know, of beginning a work of Christian cultural critique in our day by Christians are the most progressive of all people, or Christians are the most libertarian of all, whatever your ideology of the day is, say that, and Christians are the most of it. And so what is Augustine doing? Well, he's doing this, antithesis and fulfillment. And there are both of these in this idea of gloriousism. So absolutely, he says, if you want real glory, you Romans, then stop killing people with your army and look to Christ and to God. Because real, perfect, everlasting glory is to be found only in him. And of course, you've got to completely transform your idea of what glory is, just as Paul said to the Greeks and the Jews. But there's also a moment of antithesis. It's not just fulfillment. So it's provocative. So the city of God is the most glorious. Oh, which, by the way, shows that you have no idea what glory is. Here you are. We're the glory of Rome. Look at our glory. Look at our statues. Look at our Caesar and everything. It's not glorious. He's saying, you want to see what real glory is? Let me take you to school. Sit down. City of God. So there's both antithesis and fulfillment in this idea of gloriousism. And right from the very first word of the city of God, this is his agenda. This is what he's doing. Another thing I think that helps us to understand the way in which Augustine is sort of navigating culture is an idea that's been labeled his idea of splendid vices. And I think it's another way that he doesn't fall into this trap of either sort of putting the whole of culture in a rubbish bag and throwing it away, or saying culture's just wonderful and we need to remake the church in its image. And the idea of splendid vices is he starts by acknowledging the ultimate aims of Rome and the church are really very different. They're incommensurable. The church is about people knowing God forever in setting, and Rome is. And so in terms of ultimate ends, to follow Rome's way is catastrophic. It's the language that you use. You will not find God if you follow Rome's way. But in terms of intermediate ends, so how we live together in society and don't kill each other, for example, he says some things that Rome does are quite useful and better than other ways that it might do it. And that doesn't mean that it's not catastrophic eternally. And the fact that it's catastrophic eternally doesn't mean that it's not quite useful here and now. And so by dividing those two levels, if you like, from each other, he's able to affirm both without either of them compromising the other. Just because he says there are some ways that Rome does things that are really quite useful, and I'm glad it does it that way, he doesn't have to say, oh, and therefore perhaps salvation is to be found there. And just because he says this stuff is catastrophic in the long run, he doesn't have to therefore reject everything about Rome and say the whole way it's set up its society is the worst it could be, and let's sort of completely throw it away and put it in the rubbish. He's able to do both because he's divided those two levels from each other. So Rome, for him, is catastrophic eternally and strategically quite useful in some limited ways here and there. And so he's able to, quote unquote, affirm some elements of the culture without saying they're good, if you like. They're good for the moment, but they're also catastrophic. And I think that's a nuance that's really helpful for us in our cultural critique. And the final way that he navigates culture is that he says that the two cities, the city of God and the earthly city, are intertwined, is his language, in the present age. And he uses this language over and over again. You can't separate them out. So we gathered today here are not the city of God. We're a mixture. We're all late modern people. Our assumptions are late modern. Our blind spots are late modern. They're a little bit different from each other. But basically, we are the culture. We share in its ideas. We share in its instincts. We share in its joys and its pains. God. And so you can't say in this age that the city of God and the earthly city are sort of separable, that they're distinct. Okay? And this would be, again, saying, absolutely right, Constantine, he's our guy. And so Augustine says, no, wait. Because they will be disentangled from each other. So the final destiny of the cities, where he ends up the city of God, the book, is the disentangling of the two cities and their black and white destinies from each other. And what this allows, and again, Tertullian is saying, yes, that's my moment, that's what I'm. And what this allows him to do is to understand how culture can be both complex and untangleable, and how we can never get behind our own assumptions in understanding the Bible and communicating it to people, but how that is not the final word. How the Bible is not enclosed within a culture, and God is not enclosed within a culture. So he's able to, in a sense, have Tertullian's cake and Eusebius's cake, and eat them both. And what they both like in their positions. Tertullian likes his clarity. There's oil and water. We don't know which is which. Well, Augustine has that. The destinies of the cities are different. And Eusebius says, yeah, but there's stuff going on now, and we need to be in there. We need to be making an impact. We need to be relevant. And Augustine says, absolutely, that's the thing as well. And so it's your emplotment. It's your fact that the Bible is a story, that the way things are now is not the way they're always going to be, that allows you to have both of those intermingled now, but separate for eternity. And this is one of the major themes. Okay, so those were six things that we might profitably learn from Augustine, which I think are things that he has drawn himself from the Bible. I want to move on now to what is a critical theory. I've already mentioned that Augustine is the first person to have engaged in this idea of critique in the whole of it. And that's sort of my base camp for understanding what a critical theory is. What I want to do now is just try and analyze what's going on in different critical theories. So in terms of the contemporary world, we might be thinking of things like eco-theory, those who see the world through the lens of ecological concerns and the environment. Might be thinking of something like queer theory, where the idea is to queer the whole of society, and I'll come back to that idea a little bit later. Feminism, etc., etc., etc. The different ways in which critical theories are branded today. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. What do all these things do? If I want to just look at them side by side, what are they all doing? I think one way to answer that question is to say that they're making certain things viable, certain things visible, and certain things valuable. Let's just take each of those quickly one by one. So a critical theory makes certain things viable. So in other words, if I see the world in a particular way, certain ideas or ways of living will make sense to me, and certain ideas just won't. They'll be strange. Like, how could anyone believe that or do that? And isn't that the position for a lot of people who are not Christians today? It's not that they sort of weighed up the evidence for Christianity and thought, on balance, I just don't think there's enough there. It's that those people are just weird. Like, in what universe does Christianity make sense? And so where is that coming from? Well, it's the idea, one way of thinking about it is it's the idea of what Peter Berger, the sociologist, called plausibility structures. So imagine the average day. I get up at a time that I've set my alarm. I choose what I want to wear. I choose what radio station to listen to while I brush my teeth. I choose what I have for breakfast. I've got the remote control to flick over on the television to watch whatever channel I want. I'm in a job that, broadly speaking, I chose myself. I choose my lunch order. I choose when I leave work in the evening. And my day is basically a suite of choices. And then someone comes along to me and says, oh, by the way, there's a God who's Lord of the universe and who's in control of everything, and you should worship him. And I go, like, where does that fit in my life? Like, I've got no category for that. That's just weird and oppressive. And so my plausibility structure says that things make sense when I choose them. Like, that's, why we've got democracy, isn't it? That's why it works, because that intuitively makes sense to people. And so you come along with an idea of a God who doesn't fit there. And it's not that, I weigh up the evidence and I say, probably not on balance. It's that just, I've got no way of engaging with that. That is just so foreign to my plausibility structure, the way I see the world. And so what's happened is that the way I see the world has made certain things viable. And God is not one of them. And that's what critical theorists do. They make certain beliefs, certain attitudes viable. It makes sense to hold them. I can hold them with good conscience. They also make certain things visible. And I'm told that 11 million bits of information processed through our sensors every second, most of them through the eye, like 10 million or so through the eye. Our brains can only compute about 50 of those every second. So the huge majority of what we get fed is ignored. So perception, living in the world, is a strategic ignoring. We've always got to be working out, what am I going to ignore? What am I going to pay attention to? And this is also the idea of figures and grounds. So for those of you sort of looking at me at the moment, I'm probably the figure. You're paying attention to me. There's a bunch of stuff here that you're not aware of. Like, you may not have even seen that there's a cabinet in the corner, because it's not important. You're choosing what to pay attention to. Certain things are being made visible for you. Because I'm standing up here, moving around and talking, you're probably looking at me out of the cabinet. And so we always make those decisions. What am I going to focus on? Of all the things that are present. And that is true in terms of ideas and events as well. The news does that every evening, doesn't it? There's a huge amount of stuff going on in the world, and we learn about 4 or 5 of them. Why? Because people have thought that those are the important things, or those are the things that are going to get viewers for the news channel. And so in all the media, and social media, of course, does this, filter bubbles and so forth, we've been catechized, aren't we? This is important. Pay attention to this. Look at this. All the time. A continual catechesis of our attention. And you go out into Melbourne, there's signs and billboards, and it just carries on. And critical theorists do this as well. So if you think about the huge progress that's been made since, say, the 1950s, by the way in which that the oppression of women in society is now much more visible to us than it was before. It's not that before everyone thought, oh yeah, women are massively oppressed, but let's pretend that it's different. It's most people didn't realize, or were unwilling to make the effort to realize that that was happening. But feminism has made that visible. So now it's almost impossible to ignore. And this is what critical theorists systematically do. This is what the ecological movement is trying to do. Make stuff visible to us that wasn't previously visible, so that we can pay attention to. And so critical theories make certain things visible in the world. They say, look at this, make this your figure, rather than it just being in the background. And critical theories also serve to make certain things valuable. They don't just say, look at this, they say, this is important, or this is good, or this is evil. And again, if you read philosophers, if you read these critical theories, this is often what they do. This is good, praise this, enjoy this. This is evil, condemn this, distance yourself from this. And I think systematically all of these critical theories are doing these 3 things. They're making certain things viable, certain things visible, and certain things valuable. Andrew?
Are you okay to take questions along the way, or do you want to just...
I might try and get through if that's okay, just time-wise. And then we'll do a bunch of questions at the end if that's okay. Thank you. Now, I wonder if, as I sort of run through this material, a thought is occurring to you that also occurred to me. And that was the genesis of me writing the book that Andrew was talking about before. So wait a minute. Bible does this. Bible makes certain things viable. Bible makes certain things visible in the world. The widows and the orphans, the poor, you notice them if you've read the Bible, in a way that you might not if you didn't. You notice the presence of God in creation, that the heavens declare the glory of God. The Bible makes that visible for you. The Bible makes certain things valuable. God's name, for example, in a way that might not have been valuable before. So, the Bible's got a critical theory. Like, you don't need to do mental gymnastics to see that this is on every page of the Bible. This is what it's doing. And I guess the idea of a biblical critical theory is nothing more than that. It's understanding the way that the Bible helps us to see certain things in the world, to value certain things in the world and in ourselves and in God, and make certain things viable. Trusting God, for example. If you read how he's been faithful throughout the generations, trusting him becomes hugely more viable than it was when you just thought he was this weird, unspeaking force in the sky. Like, how do you trust that? Read the Bible. Okay, I can see how you can trust God. Another way to break these critical theories down is to see them as a series of what we can think of as figures. So the idea here is a figure of speech. You think of a metaphor. Melbourne is a salad bowl. Okay, something like that. Now, Melbourne could be anything. Melbourne could be a cesspit or anything. But in each case, the structure is the same. It's still a metaphor, but the content could be anything you like. Melbourne could be anything. And so the idea is that there's a constancy of structure, but the content changes and swaps in and out. And that's the idea of a figure of speech, isn't it? Metaphor is a metaphor. It's a metaphor, but all metaphors are different. And so if you think about the structure of the way that these critical theories work, there are certain things that you can pick on, I think, certain things that remain constant. And we can think of them in these different categories. So there's the way that a critical theory carves up time and space. Is time just one thing after another, after another, after another, after another? Or is there, as the Bible says, is there some structure to time? It had a beginning, it's going to have an end, there's a story. And also space. There's the idea of, are some spaces holier than others, for example? The temple, or is just one space like another? So different theories will think of space and time in different ways. Structure of reality, that means these big, grand metaphysical, like, modern society would say there's just bodies, in other words, matter and motion. That's it. That's your structure of reality. There's stuff and it moves, nothing more. And of course, the Bible will want to go beyond that. Relationships, how are relationships structured in a particular way of looking at the world? Is the individual the unit that we start with? Is the family the unit that we start with? Is the community the unit that we start with? How do we think about relationships in a particular view of the world? Behavior, what is it good to do as a human being? And in here we've got ideas like habits, ways that our society habituates us into acting in certain ways. And one of the people who's written very well on this recently is James K. Smith, in his idea of cultural liturgies, ways in which society embeds particular ways of behaving in us so that they just become the way that we are. We don't think that there are other alternate objects. These could be big objects like this sort of room, for example, the fact that I'm standing up, everyone's facing me. That's not random. We're trying to give off a message with putting things in this way. We could have set the room up differently. Could have had a circle. That would have given off a different message. And so there's the objects like the chairs that we sit on. We're not on the floor. We're not standing up. There's the layout of Melbourne itself. All these objects push us into behaving in different ways. Like, you'd be much more willing to sort of interrupt me, I think, if we're all walking around in the room. The fact that you're sitting down and you've got computers in front of you and I'm standing up here, it sort of predisposes us to acting in a particular language, ideas and stories. If you haven't got a word for it, it's very hard to see it. It's very hard to understand something if there's no language to express it. And therefore, our language has a huge power. There's the words that we use to talk about particular things channel us into thinking about those things in particular ways. And that's why there's such a battle over language in a lot of the culture wars, because it matters. The words that we use shape our view of reality. And so all of these different elements will be present, I think, in critical theories. They'll all influence these different figures of understanding. And when you take them all together, these figures form a world. In the way that we talk about, the world of stamp collecting, or the world of the New Testament, a particular outlook, a particular way of being in reality, a way of understanding myself and everything around me. That's a world. And these figures together catechize us, form us into a particular world. And that's what a critical theory does. And those who sort of live through these critical theories, I think this is what's going on. These things are being shaped. Their world is being formed out by various different theories. And of course, the Bible does all of these as well. I won't belabor them, but each of these categories, the Bible shapes an understanding of and helps us to live in the world in particular ways in relation to these 6 different categories of figures. And so if we want to try and put flesh on the bones of what is a biblical critical theory, you would say it's the way that the Bible shapes us in these different areas. So, what does a biblical theory, critical theory, give us in terms of understanding and living within and engaging with late modern Australian culture? The two main things that I think it's worth taking away from an engagement with biblical critical theory. First of all, this idea of subversive fulfillment that I've already talked about quite a lot, so I won't go over that again. But I think again and again the Bible does this, and it's a really important move to be aware of and to consider for our own engagements with culture. And the second one I want to talk about a little bit is diagonalization. And in a sense, I've already done this without using the name. It was the Tertullian on one side, Eusebius on the other. They're at each other like cats, but actually they're both taking part of a bigger reality, which is Paul in 1 Corinthians 1, splitting those two parts apart and making them fight each other. And so what diagonalization does is it looks at dualisms or dichotomies in our culture. And late modern culture is full of dualisms. It loves dichotomies. And what he says is, well, neither of those is utterly obnoxious. But what you've done is you've taken a beautiful biblical reality, a harmonious reality. You've ripped two limbs off it, and you've set them up against each other as if they were opposed. Whereas actually, if you go back to the Bible, you find that these things work really well together in the context of God's revelation. And so modernity sort of runs on the fuel of these dichotomies. You've got the dichotomy between signs, language, and things, between subjects and objects, the idea that we humans are the ones with all the agency and power and everything else is just sitting there waiting for something to be done to it, including the natural world, which a lot of people would say is the reason we've got ourselves in such a pickle with the environment. We thought it was just sitting there inertly waiting for something to happen to it. Superstition and enlightenment, thank goodness we don't have any of those superstitions anymore. After the Enlightenment, we are purely rational now, for either side relief. Heteronomy and autonomy, I'm either completely in control of myself, or I'm a slave to someone else's passions and desires. Prejudice and free thought, thank goodness we have all of the second and none of the first. And tradition and modernity, thank you, thank goodness that we left tradition behind and now we're fully modern. And each time the Bible doesn't pick a side. And the reason that it doesn't pick a side is that both of them are reductive heresies of a full-orbed biblical truth. And so what the Bible will often do is say, let me show you how you can have the best of both of those worlds. Not in a sort of wishy-washy, lukewarm, meet you in the middle sort of way. No, absolutely not. In a way that shows that both of those things are bad copies of a reality that precedes them, which is God's reality, which shows how both of them work together before you ever ripped them apart. So you're not trying to stick things together. You're trying to show how they were originally ripped apart, how society is written. So one example would be in the ancient world, you had a choice. Either you could plump for an absolute ultimate reality. So, Aristotle has his prime mover, which is a sort of absolute first cause of the universe. Or you could plump for a personal ultimate reality. So the Greek god Zeus and the whole pantheon of gods, who are very personal and have all the foibles that humans are prone to, but they're not absolute. They're not outside of all creation in the same way that the biblical God. And so, do you want the ultimate God who's absolute, which sort of gives you the sciences and predictability and law and justice and all those things that we need an objective measure for? Or do you plug for a God that's personal, which gives you the arts and literature and the value of humanity and all that wonderful stuff that gets us out of bed in the morning? It's a very poor choice to have to make, isn't it? I want both. I want law to work, and I want to be able to enjoy films and literature as well. I don't have to choose between those. And the Bible says, well, both those are reductive heresies from what some theologians have called God's absolute personality. So the God of the Bible is absolute. He's outside creation. He's not part of the created order. But he's also personal. One God in three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. You can't dig deeper than God's personality. It's not that his personality emerges somewhere along the line from a sort of concatenation of forces. No. God is personal all the way down. Personality is fundamental in our universe, and absoluteness, universality, things you can count on, they're not going to change, are fundamental in our universe. And it's not that the Bible tries to sellotape those two together. It's that, no, they were originally together in God. And what our society has done is it's got the meat cleaver out, chopped them apart from each other, and set them up in competition with each other. Rather foolishly, in my opinion. And so that's diagonalization. Let me just do one more example of it to show you a more sort of contemporary, less abstract philosophical idea. So the Brexit debate for a few years ago in the UK set two groups of people against each other. On one side, there were the Brexiteers, the people who wanted to leave the European Union, and they valued the irreducible individuality of the UK. And they felt that is getting swallowed up in this European superstate. We're made to be like everybody else. We want to be ourselves. We want to be individual and singular and proud of who we are. And on the other side were the Remainers, the people who wanted to stay in the European Union. And they were saying, we want to be open to the outside. We don't want to be insular and just protective of our own little patch. We want to be welcoming people in. We want to be going out into the world. We want to be a part of a world community. We want to work together with people. And the former Bishop of London, Graham Tomlin, wrote a lovely pamphlet on this. And he said, guys, what you need is the incarnation. Because in the incarnation, the universal absolute God becomes particular, takes on human flesh, becomes a first century Palestinian carpenter's son, as opposed to anyone else. There is particularity in the incarnation, but there's also universality. And so what a tragedy that these two sides were butting heads against each other and unable to see the way in which both of their sets of values could be fulfilled at the same time. It's not that like one of these sets of values is right and the other's wrong, and the Bible's going to show us which one it is. It's that the Bible shows us how both of them are reductive. And actually there's a way to have what the Brexiteers intuit about singularity and the beauty of things that are individual and not interchangeable. Yes, that's right. But also the openness and universality. You're not shutting yourself off from the world. There's something beautiful in that too. Yet you don't need to fight. Both of them are fulfilled in the incarnation of Christ. And that's what Graham Tomlin showed. The Word, the Logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. And subversive fulfillment, diagonalization, then, I think, are the two go-to tools in our toolbox of Christian engagement. They're the screwdriver and the hammer, if you like. They're the most often used implements for cultural engagement if we're thinking of biblical critique. I want just to walk through two biblical figures now to give you a sense of how they work and the sort of implications that they can have for society. The first one is called the asymmetry of good and evil, which just basically means that Genesis 1 and Genesis 3 are not the same chapter. Genesis 1, it was very good, comes before Genesis 3. Cursed is the ground because of you, and so on. And therefore, good and evil are not equal and opposite. We're not living in a dualistic universe where there's a good God and a bad God, and they're about as strong as each other and they're fighting it out. Not at all. Evil is part of the created order. The serpent was craftier than any of the other creatures God had made. So it's not a second God, it's a creature. So there's this radical asymmetry. Good is not the mirror image of evil in the Bible. And this comes out in three ways. First of all, time, Genesis 1 before Genesis 3. Secondly, being. In other words, Satan is not a second God, but the serpent is a creature. And thirdly, blessing. So Genesis 1, God creates Adam and Eve in the image of God. Now, Genesis 3 doesn't obliterate that. The image of God isn't completely got away with. And if you'll notice, really interestingly, Adam and Eve are not directly cursed in Genesis 3 either. It's childbearing and producing crops from the field that's going to be really hard. God never says, cursed are you, Adam. And he never says, cursed are you. He's just a serpent, not to them. And so even in the peak moment of devastation, there's a, well, the French would call it a holding back by God. It's not a full-on, I'm going to blitz you now with these curses. And of course, there's the Proto-Evangelion where God makes clothes for Adam and Eve, and he suggests that the offspring of Eve will crush the serpent's heel. So there's no symmetry between good and evil. Now, this is cultural dynamite for various reasons. I'll just mention three of them. First of all, asymmetry and cultural critique. So given that Genesis 1 is not Genesis 3. What do Christians expect to find when we go out into culture? Now, so footnote, I'm not talking about redemption. Obviously, there's a huge amount to say about redemption, but I'm aware of time already, so I'm just doing creation and fall. Yes, there will be a whole another chapter on redemption. What do Christians expect to find in culture? Well, we expect to find a good thing spoiled, or a good thing that's been written over, scrawled over, and, so graffitied over. Because everything was very good, but everything's been messed up. The creation itself has been messed up, Romans 8, by what Adam did. And so that means that Christians have a dispositionally open attitude to culture. Because we believe, see if you think this is right, I think this is biblical. We believe that nothing in this world is utterly and completely, unremittingly evil. Because only the devil is unremittingly. And we believe that no artifact of human cultural production or no human institution is utterly and unremittingly good, because only God is good, as Jesus tells us. And so you open a book, you watch a film, whatever you do, you encounter a culture, you're going to expect to find some good things there, because this is a world that was created good. But whatever book or film or institution or culture you encounter, you're also going to expect to find some messed up things, because nothing has survived the fall intact. And that means that Christians are massively open to, bring it on, show me what this culture is. I've got to, there's going to be something good in here. There's also going to be something really problematic in here. But if you find your measure of what is good and evil within the created order, which Christians don't do because only God is good, if you find your measure of good and evil within the created order, you have to have a closed mind to some aspects of cultural production at the risk of losing your ethics. Because if you get your measure of good and evil, for example, from the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or from a liberalizing market and state control, then either I've got to say that is my measure of what is good, and therefore I'm going to close my mind to anything that contradicts that, or you've got to say I'm going to lose my measure of what's good. I'm sort of lost on a sea of relativism. And so it's only the Christian, or only the person who has a source of good and evil outside the created order, that can say, I'm open. There's going to be some stuff that's better than other stuff, of course. We're not saying that everything is equal. But within every cultural artifact and every cultural institution, there's going to be creation and fall. That's what the Christian is predisposed to expect, I would suggest. So asymmetry provides a very strong basis for cultural critique. And Tim Keller at one point says that Christians ought to make, notice the ought to, Christians ought to make the best cultural critics, or be among the best cultural critics, because of this constitutive openness that we have to all of culture. Asymmetry and politics. Now, politics is largely about finding a position from which to critique the status quo. Nobody says everything is brilliant just as it is. Our policy is to change nothing. Nobody has got elected by saying that. There's always, we want more of this, we want less of that. And in order to do that, you've got to find a position, an ideological position in which to look at the status quo with some critical distance and say this is good and this is bad. The question is, where do you find that position? How do you generate that position? The problem, if you have a flat view of time and no difference between creation and fall, is that you've got no way of saying the way things are now is not as they should be. Because, well, the way things are now is just the way things are. And the way I am, and the way my brain is. There's nothing outside the way things are. All I can do is try and bootstrap myself out of the way things are to get some sort of critical standpoint. And so fundamentally, you have to fall back on the position, eventually, that the world as it is normative. It sets the norm. Because if not, then what? And you say, well, our ideas. Yeah, but where do our ideas come from? They come from that same flat reality. So you're fooling yourself if you think you're levering yourself to get some sort of ideological standpoint outside the status quo from which to critique things in any rigorous and fundamental way. But of course, the asymmetry of good and evil doesn't leave the Christian there. So, and I've added redemption into this diagram because it would be perverse to leave it out. So there have been two fundamental ruptures for the Christian. The rupture between creation and fall, and then there's going to be a second rupture with the new heavens and the new earth and the pits of fire and so forth. And that gives you a point outside the status quo for which to critique the status quo. So when Christians critique how things are at the moment, we can do so from the standpoint of redemption. In fact, who is it? It's the Marxist Theodor Adorno uses this language, the standpoint of redemption, because he intuits that you need a position outside the status quo to be able to meaningfully critique what's happening there. And this asymmetry of good and evil gives Christians a normativity that is not how things are at the moment. You know, we can look out into the world and say, this is not how it should be. And we can say that standing on firm ground, because this is not how God made it. It's not how he's going to leave it. And it's the asymmetry of good and evil. It's the fact that Genesis 1 is not Genesis 3 that allows us to say that. Thirdly, asymmetry in culture making. In his book, Art and the Bible, Francis Schaeffer has a really, really helpful way, I think, of thinking about culture. He says culture has a major theme and a minor theme. Major theme for Schaeffer is the goodness of creation. Again, the major because Genesis 1 before Genesis 3, sin is not the final word in God's story. So the goodness of creation is a major thing. But there's also a minor thing, which is the brokenness and fallenness and pain and anguish and suffering and death and malice and evil. And Schaeffer puts forward the argument that good Christian art will reflect that reality. That over the body of a particular artist's work, he suggests, you should be able to see these themes in some sort of proportion, that the major theme be the major theme, the minor theme. Now, we can argue about that in terms of art, but what I want us to take away from it is the idea of these two things, and that they're not equal. And he says that we should avoid simply taking one of these things and making it the whole of our reality. So a classic example of someone who takes the major theme of the goodness of creation and builds a body of art completely around that idea by itself would be Thomas Kincaid. You're aware of his saccharine pictures of a beautiful sort of Disneyfied world in which everybody's happy all of the time. Schaeffer would say, well, that's just the major. But we can go too far in the opposite direction, can't we? And we can sort of scoff at Kincaid. Well, I'm not going to fall into that trap of Christian kitsch. I'm going to watch The Handmaid's Tale on hard repeat. And I'm only ever going to be Dostoevsky because I'm a real sort of, I can deal with reality. And Schaeffer would say that's just as unrealistic. You know, the minor theme is not all that there is, nor is the major theme all that there. He's saying we should be able to hold these two together. And it's the asymmetry of good and evil, I think, that gives Christians, again, the basis upon which to hold these two things together and not to sort of go all in on either the major theme or all in on the minor theme. Secondly, this is my final section, the great reversal. Again and again and again and again, in a way that is very culturally odd and singular, the Bible upends social expectations and the way that we would imagine things to be done, which is that clever and powerful and rich people get all the good things, and those who don't have those things have to cope with what's left. Like, that's how society works, isn't it? Like, isn't that how our society works? Isn't that how Roman society worked? Like, you were born in a particular stratum of society, you pretty much stayed there. You know, good luck to you if you wanted to try and move. If you think about, you know, all ancient societies, think about those stone carvings in the British Museum, you know, the ancient Babylon. You know, it's the king fighting the lions, isn't it? The strong is really, really strong, and other people don't deserve a mention. Like, that's society, that's us, pretty much, still, you know, with some nuance. But the Bible comes in, and God chooses an octogenarian idol worshipper to be the father of many nations, and he chooses a barren woman to be the progenitor of the Messiah. And God chooses Isaac, the younger brother, over the elder. And Jacob, again, through Jacob's own machinations, ends up being the heir of the promise. And the child who is forced to be abandoned with a speech impediment, who spent quite a bit of his life as a shepherd, ends up being the one who leads God's people out of slavery in Egypt. Not some sort of wonderful Caesar-like or Xerxes-like leader. David, you know, quite pointedly is the younger. Like, think of how Samuel labors this. He's the youngest of the brothers, isn't he? He's like, you know, his dad says, no, I've got no other sons. Yes, right. All the important people have gone. And there's this guy called David, but like he smells me. You know, he's out there with sheep. And that's like being I don't know what the equivalent today is. Perhaps a cleaner who comes in before the office opens in the morning. Like, yeah, but you won't be trusted. Now, God is. Like, David is the one who has a heart after God's own heart. David is the one God wants. Queen. Ruth, the Moabitess, is grafted into the genealogy that leads to the Messiah. Mary, the nondescript, probably very young, maybe artisanal family person. Like, these are not the people you would expect if you had any other culture. These are not the people you'd have expected God to, and of course Jesus, the carpenter's son, the savior of the world, the creator of the world, from Galilee. Galilee. When you're going to have to help me here. When I'm in the UK, I always say Barnsley. Like, because I come from Barnsley, I wanted to say that. Like, what is that for Australia?
Melbourne.
Brixton.
We're going for Barnsley. Like, the guy comes from Brixton. He's never visited Sydney or Melbourne. Like, how do you expect him to visit? And one way of thinking about this is that the Bible is non-linear. And what I mean by that is that we have certain expectations of how things run. The rich use their riches to get richer. The power use their power to get more powerful. That's in a straight line. Nothing upsets that trajectory. But the Bible always is doing these handbrake turns. It's like the rich, are sent empty away. Think of the Magnificat. And the humble are exalted. Whoa, wasn't expecting that. Where did that come from? And this is the great reversal, that God reverses our expectations time and time again in a most wonderful and delicious way in the Bible. It is a constitutively non-linear book. So how does that help us in cultural critique? Well, first of all, let's think of politics and society. I think there's a danger that our view of poverty and riches resolves to one of two extremes, and I think they're both sub-biblical. The first is, blessed are you because you are who are rich, because you are rich. This is the money makes money, success breeds success. If you're born in the right family, you'll end up in the right place in life. This sort of idea of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And sometimes the way that people kick back against that is, blessed are you who are poor because you are poor. There's some sort of inherent worthiness about being on the wrong side of life. That in itself is one's credentials to be made much of. And the Bible itself, I think, doesn't follow either of those. Christ says, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. And you'll notice it doesn't say everyone who is poor is Christian, or nobody who is rich can ever enter the kingdom of God. Although, pretty close, doesn't it? It's pretty close. So it doesn't fall into either of those two dichotomous positions. And I think we find them cashing themselves out in different ways in society. So, for example, think about approaches to justice, to criminal. You've got broadly two camps, and we can somewhat caricaturally label them left and right. There are nuances, but for the sake of time, let's just label them. So the right will stress personal responsibility. If you're poor because you haven't worked, come on, get on your bike, get a job, pull yourselves up, you can do it, like everybody else. The left will highlight systematic injustice. Those who are poor not because of any fault in themselves, but because of the system. It's the structures that keep them down. And what we need to do is change the structures. Now, again, I don't think we'd want to reject either of those completely out of hand. I think we want to say both of those are sort of dismembering parts of a bigger reality and setting them against each other as if it's either responsibility or it's the structures. Well, no, there's a more complex biblical reality, I think, that makes sense of both of those in a broader context. And if you think of the history of human society, the different ways that people have got on in life, for most of human society has been progeniture. It's where you're born. If you're born rich, you're rich. If you're born in a high caste, you stay high caste. If you're born the daughter of a king or the son of a king, you're a princess or a prince. And if you're not, then you're not. We broadly replace that, more or less, by meritocracy. Or at least we like to think we have. If you work hard, then you get on. Anyone can become US president. Okay? It's those who work the hardest who find themselves in the top places. Now, in a brilliant book called The Tyranny of Merit, Michael Sandel pulls this apart. He says this is just as oppressive and tyrannical as the idea of primogeniture, because what happens if I don't make it? It's my fault. I haven't worked hard enough. Didn't put the hours in. Wasn't good enough. It's on me if I'm a failure in life. So me, if I don't make it to the top, if I'm not in the 1%, 99% of people, of course, are not. So it loads upon us the burden of our own salvation. So if you don't make it, that's on you. Because we live in a meritocracy and everyone who works hard makes it. So neither of these is a wonderful panacea. But again, the Christian wouldn't just want to plump for one rather than the other, would we? You know, primogeniture is a fundamentally unjust way of running a society. And, you know, you read The Tyranny of Merit, and you see that meritocracy is pretty stinky as well. So we'd want to not simply avoid taking sides in that culture war and sort of stand above it all and say, oh, we don't, you know, all your positions are inadequate. We don't. No, you get involved, but not by completely assimilating either of those two positions. How the Great Reversal has changed us. This is a theme I'm going to pick up on a little bit more this afternoon. This has become, I think, so part of who we are in society that we miss the fact that we live this. This is us. We have become, in this sense, Christian as a society, in this sense. Okay, don't hear me say we are a Christian society. I'm going to say more about that this afternoon. But in this sense, I think we're really Christian. Because if you think about the culture of charity and international aid that we have, like, you would be hard-pressed to find people today who would say we should give no money at all to other countries. We should keep it all for us. I mean, there may be. But the majority of people say, look, you know, if there's just been an earthquake or something, if there's, you know, a massive natural disaster, then yeah, let's go and help. But that's weird. Like, they're not us. They're not our nation. You know, you help your family, and pretty much everybody does that. You sort of help your nation. Most cultures have done that. But like to help people on the other side of the world, got nothing to do with you. Like, why would you do that? And why, when I say, why would you do that, do most of us think, well, that's obvious. Because we've been catechized into the Great Reversal. That we understand that there's one God over the whole universe and that he made everybody in his image, that he cares for everybody, and that he commands us to care for the widows and orphans. And that's just become part of who we are. Social reform. So not just in terms of giving aid, but in terms of recreating society in a way that helps the most vulnerable and the weakest. Like hospitals are a Christian idea. Like, why not just let people fend for themselves? And if they've got money to pay for a doctor, then great. And if not, well, then, you know, they should have worked harder. Why have hospitals for people who can't afford hospitals? And why try and build measures of equality and equity into our society? Like, isn't that against the natural order where those who are really strong can use their strength and, you know, Rome is glorious because it dominates? Like, where does that come from? That's part of the legacy of Christianity. Liberation movements as well. You know, so the 1950s to the 1970s saw a whole suite of liberation movements, mainly based in African countries. And we're often really quick to say the abolition of slavery and the end of slavery, blah, 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 William Wilberforce, evangelical Christian, that's wonderful. But you can also see the footprints, the fingerprints of this great reversal in the very secular, very violent liberation movement, twisted and distorted, of course. So if you think of someone like Frantz Fanon, one of the great minds behind these African liberation movements, he says at one point, what I'm really trying to get across is the idea in, you know, throwing off the colonial yoke, and this is the language he uses, that the last will be first. And that's what he says. Now, he thinks that the way that you do that is at the barrel of the gun, of course, and the Bible would have... I think the Bible might have an issue with it. But the principle is the same. The idea that there is an overturning of the social order in favour of the oppressed comes right back to this idea, the Great Reversal. Social hierarchies as well. The idea that a stratified society isn't the best way of organising society. Like, that took a lot of time for people to get their heads around. Like, well, if you don't have order, then society's going to fall apart. People were saying for centuries and centuries. You've got to have one king or queen who's the ruler, and then everyone else doing what they say. Well, in the same way, you know, these were the sort of arguments that we use. Well, there's one sun in the centre of the solar system, and all the planets go around it. So, like, you're following nature. Isn't that the natural way to do it? And the idea of flattening the social hierarchy, I think, comes from this idea of the Great Reversal as well. The idea that our leaders should be our servants or our ministers, you know, government ministers. What an odd idea. Can you imagine Xerxes saying, I am the servant of the people, now I'm going to execute? Yeah, it's like, it doesn't work that way. Like, what Caesar would have genuinely said, I am here to serve them. No, I'm not. I'm here to be a god. Gods don't serve. Zeus doesn't serve us. The idea that our leaders are our servants, which for us is intuitive, like, of course, don't be stupid. Yes, of course our leaders are our servants. Well, that came from this great reversal. A new ethic of beauty as well. And I think this is one of the things that, because it's so who we are, we so miss. So in the ancient world, if you're beautiful, you're virtuous. You read Homer, all the virtuous people are pretty. And the prettier they are, the better they are. And there's this wonderful line from Tom Holland in his book Dominion. He says, on the battlefield of Troy, only the vile were ugly. Okay, so if you want to show that someone's a bad character, you make them ugly. What does Christianity do? Well, what did Jesus love? No idea. Have we? Isaiah 53. No, it was just pretty ordinary. I mean, did he wear his beard long or short? Was he tall or a bit of a belly? No one knows. There's a point towards that. Say, Jesus is not Achilles. He is not the fairest of all men. Okay? Disengage your idea of physical beauty from moral virtue. That's not what it's about. How liberating is that? My goodness me. Are we glad that we live in a country that's done that, in a culture that's done that, that doesn't say, and of course, some of the old Greek and Roman ethic is still there. You look at pictures of people in magazines. Or, this is a really good one. You look at biopics and you compare the person the film is about with the actor they chose to play them. They're always prettier. They're always more happy. So we still do that. But Christianity pushes against that, thank goodness. Gender relationships as well. Just think of Jesus's relationship with women. And Rebecca McLaughlin just wrote out a beautiful book about this as well. Now, even if that is sort of, well, I should jolly well hope he does, we would say, think of how that dropped in the culture at the time. When men thought of nothing of using their wives or other female slaves as orifices for relieving their every need in the same way that you use a urinal. Like that's the way things are, isn't it? Jesus drops into that culture and says, absolutely not. And of course, the Old Testament was doing this before him as well. And so granting new position, an exalted position, an equal position to women, I think, in a way that our society is still working its way through. We're still battling with some of the old Greek and Roman ideas. And, I'm not suggesting that Christians are squeaky clean either. That we've got a lot of working to be doing himself. But Jesus shows us a different way of relating between the genders. Now, this last point here is trying to show that this is not just little pockets of things going on in society. It's not that we've got international aid over here, and we've got servant leadership over there. It's coherent. It's part of a world in the sense that I was using world before. These are different figures that form a particular world. It's a biblical way of living in late modernity. To see these things as valuable. First of all, to see these things, they're visible, but then to see them as valuable as well. And this is the world that the Bible has bequeathed to us. Now, I have spoken longer perhaps than I intended to, but it is all very exciting material, and I got a little bit carried away. So sorry about that.